Franz Kafka, entered the world quietly on July 3, 1883, in Prague, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The city around him was a place where languages overlapped, where German, Czech, and Yiddish passed each other daily on the narrow streets. None of this meant much to the newborn, of course, but the layers of culture he was born into would later shape the atmosphere of his imagination. He was the first surviving child of Hermann and Julie Kafka. His father, a self-made businessman, believed in firm discipline and unrelenting effort. His mother, educated and gentle, moved between household responsibilities and helping with the family shop. From the beginning, Franz grew up between these two temperaments, one forceful, one quiet. This balance would become one of the subtle tensions of his early life. The family lived in a modest apartment in the Old Town. Life there was orderly. Breakfasts happened at the same time each morning. Afternoons passed in the shop downstairs. Evenings settled into a predictable hush. Franz, as a young child, adapted to routines without protest. He didn't demand much attention. Most of the time he watched, listened, and tried not to disturb the stillness around him. Even at a young age, those around him noticed his calm nature. He rarely shouted or ran wildly like other children. Instead, he would sit by a window or a corner of a room and wonder quietly about things he didn't yet have words for. Dolls, blocks, and picture books were enough to occupy him. What he wanted most was space to observe. He did not yet know that this careful watching would one day become part of how he wrote. Prague in the late 1880s was a place of chimneys, horse carts, and crowded squares. Franz saw only fragments of this world, small details that stayed with him. A policeman directing carriages, a baker shouting the morning's news, the clatter of wheels on cobblestone. These impressions made up the background of his early memory, faint but steady, and formed the rhythm of his everyday surroundings. At home, his father's presence stood out. Hermann Kafka was ambitious and loud, a man whose voice seemed to fill a room even when he wasn't angry. Franz, still very young, reacted by becoming even quieter. He didn't resist. He simply stepped back. This instinct to withdraw rather than confront would follow him throughout life, though no one could have known it then. His mother, Julie, provided the softer edge of the household. She made sure the children were fed, dressed, and kept within the expectations of the family's social circle. Although she had studied and was capable of independent thought, her days were soon consumed by work and parenthood. Her influence on Franz came not from long conversations, but from the sense of stability she maintained around him. By the end of this period of his childhood, nothing dramatic had happened. There were no major events, no sharp turning points, no sudden changes. He was simply a thoughtful child in a large, busy city, held between a demanding father and a gentle mother. Yet within these ordinary early years, something had begun to shape itself quietly. A sensitivity to the world, an awareness of tension, and a habit of careful observation. These would not become important until much later, but in the quiet rooms of his childhood home, the first traces of Franz Kafka's inner world were forming. When Franz Kafka reached school age, his world widened in a steady, measured way. The quiet apartment of his early childhood gave way to structured days filled with lessons, uniforms, and the expectations of teachers who valued order as much as his father did. For a boy who preferred the safety of corners and quiet, this change demanded a new kind of adjustment. His formal education began at the German-speaking elementary school in Prague. The classrooms there were strict but predictable. Desks were arranged in straight rows, chalk dust floated in the air, and the day moved according to the teacher's instructions. Franz adapted to this environment in the same way he adapted to everything else, silently and without resistance. He was not a troublesome student. He rarely called attention to himself, rarely needed correction, and rarely offered opinions unless asked directly. Teachers appreciated his cooperation, even if they occasionally wondered what went on behind his thoughtful, reserved expression. He learned quickly, but not aggressively. When other boys competed to answer questions first, Franz waited until called upon. He understood the material without announcing that he did. This quiet competence made him dependable, but easy to overlook. As he progressed through primary school, Franz became more aware of the differences between home and school, between himself and others, and between the languages he heard around him. German was the language of instruction. Czech was the language of the streets. His extended family spoke Yiddish on certain occasions. None of this confused him, but it added layers to his perception of the world. He did not feel entirely rooted in any one environment. He moved among them carefully, learning to observe before participating. While classmates bonded easily through games and arguments, Franz often stayed on the edge, not excluded, but not fully engaged either. This social distance wasn't dramatic. It wasn't painful. It simply felt natural to him. A quiet boy stayed quiet. By the time he entered gymnasium, the rigorous secondary school that prepared students for university, his academic strengths were clear. He excelled in languages, absorbed literature eagerly, and handled analytical subjects without difficulty. The gymnasium schedule was demanding, filled with Latin, Greek, history, mathematics, and moral instruction. Franz kept up with the workload even as he grew more aware of the expectations placed upon him. His father valued achievement as proof of discipline, and Franz understood this, though he did not share his father's sense of urgency. He studied because it was required, not because he feared punishment or craved praise. In literature, however, something stirred quietly. Stories, poems, and philosophical essays caught his attention more deeply than other subjects. He didn't announce this interest to anyone. He simply took note of it, carrying it around as a private source of engagement. Despite his shyness, Franz did form a few friendships during these years. They were not loud or dramatic bonds, but steady ones based on shared conversations and mutual understanding. His friends described him later as thoughtful, often funny in a dry and indirect way, and more comfortable in small groups than in crowds. Most friendships developed gradually, often through quiet moments between classes or long walks home. He didn't seek attention, but some classmates gravitated toward him because of his calm nature. Gentle humor occasionally slipped through his reserve, surprising those who only knew him from a distance. Even so, he often felt slightly separate from the groups he joined. This sense of being present, but not fully anchored, would stay with him long after school ended. The academic pressure of gymnasium was considerable. Teachers expected precision, uniformity, and strict attention to detail. Franz met these expectations, but the environment sharpened his awareness of his own limitations. He was competent, but he did not feel remarkable. He was capable, but he often doubted the value of his own thoughts. This mixture of competence and self-doubt became part of his internal landscape. It didn't hinder his performance, but it shaped the way he approached challenges. He learned to work diligently, even when uncertain. He learned to keep silent, even when he had ideas he could have shared. He learned that calmness was easier than confrontation. These tendencies didn't attract notice then, but they would become significant later when he began writing in earnest. Throughout his school years, Prague continued to grow and transform. New buildings emerged, political tensions simmered, and industrial progress crept into everyday life. Franz witnessed these changes in a distanced way, noting the noise and motion without being drawn into them. He walked through the city on his way to school, observing shopkeepers raising shutters, vendors calling out prices, and workers hurrying to factories. The contrast between public energy and his private world remained stark. He lived inside routines, not aspirations. As he approached the end of his gymnasium education, Franz felt the weight of approaching adulthood. University choices loomed ahead, and with them the question of what direction his life should take. He was not rebellious, and he didn't resist the idea of further study, but he also didn't possess a clear ambition. What he enjoyed, reading, thinking, writing small reflections in notebooks, did not yet seem like a viable path. His father's business-minded practicality hung in the background, shaping the likely outcome. By 1901, when Franz finally completed his secondary schooling, he carried with him a solid academic record, a quiet manner of moving through the world, and the first hints of an inner life richer than his outward behavior revealed. He did not know yet what he would study. He did not know how strongly writing would call to him. But he moved forward, as he always had, by following the next requirement, the next expectation, the next step laid out in front of him. And the next step was university. When Franz Kafka completed his law degree in 1906, he stepped into a stage of life shaped less by personal ambition and more by necessity. Earning a living was the next logical step. He didn't resist it. He didn't celebrate it. He simply moved into it, with the same quiet acceptance that had guided him since childhood. Before he could begin professional work, he had to complete a mandatory year of unpaid legal service, working as a law clerk in various courts around Prague. It was a period defined by observation rather than action. Clerks assisted judges, sorted documents, and became familiar with the machinery of the legal system. Franz fulfilled these duties without complaint. He learned the routines of the courthouse, the measured pace of hearings, the calm voices of clerks, the shuffling of papers across long wooden tables. The environment was formal, structured, and predictable. It suited him in a practical sense, even if it held no deeper meaning for him. He performed the tasks he was assigned, nothing more, nothing less. There was no desire for a legal career forming within him, just the quiet acknowledgement that this was the path expected. After this required service ended, Franz began searching for paid employment. The search did not take long. In 1908, he was hired by the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute for the Kingdom of Bohemia, an institution responsible for managing insurance claims and assessing workplace safety. It was not a glamorous job. It did not place him in courtrooms or prestigious offices. Instead, it placed him at a desk where he reviewed files, studied accident reports, and wrote detailed summaries. It was steady, bureaucratic work. Franz accepted it without resistance. The job provided a stable income and a structured day. He needed both. The office ran on quiet routines. Employees arrived at the same time each morning, took their places at their desks, and worked steadily through the day. There were no loud announcements, no dramatic deadlines, just the steady handling of cases, one after another. The thick files, the formal language, and the meticulous record-keeping gave the work a weight that felt mechanical. Franz absorbed this rhythm easily. He didn't enjoy it, but he did it well. His reports were clear, organized, and thorough. Supervisors appreciated the precision of his work, even if they noticed his reserved nature. He rarely engaged in office chatter and kept personal matters to himself. Lunch breaks were often solitary or spent in quiet conversation with one or two colleagues he trusted. What made this period significant, though not outwardly dramatic, was the way it shaped Franz's daily routine. His days belonged to the office, but his evenings, those hours after the city grew quieter, became the space where his real interests lived. He would return home, eat a simple meal, and then sit at his desk, often late into the night, writing. Short pieces at first, fragments of thoughts, beginnings of stories he wasn't sure he would finish. The act of writing became a counterbalance to the rigid structure of his job. This contrast, order by day, imagination by night, was becoming a fixed pattern. The insurance office demanded attention to detail, and this demand slowly influenced Franz's approach to writing. His stories, still private at this stage, grew more precise. He wrote with carefully chosen words, trimmed sentences, and a quiet discipline that mirrored his daytime work. This cross-influence was subtle, but important. It shaped the style that would eventually make him distinctive, though he had no reason to anticipate that yet. As the years passed, Franz became more aware of the tension between the demands of adulthood and his private desire to write. The job exhausted him, not through physical labor, but through the steady drain of responsibility. Still, he continued. He needed the income, and he had no alternative plan. At the same time, the urge to write became stronger. The stories that formed in his mind didn't go away. They gathered, waited, and pushed against the boundaries of his quiet routine. He kept these impulses contained within night hours, often sacrificing sleep to satisfy them. He was becoming, quietly and unintentionally, a man divided between obligation and creativity. During these years, friendships from university continued, especially with Max Brod. Brod's enthusiasm for literature and culture created opportunities for Franz to engage with Prague's intellectual circles. He attended occasional readings, small gatherings, and discussions where writers talked about their work. Franz often stood at the edges of these events, listening more than speaking. He was not yet a public literary figure. He was simply someone who wrote privately and participated cautiously in conversations about art. But these interactions made one thing clear. Writing mattered to him more than anything else in his life, even if he hadn't admitted it openly. Late in this period, Franz began sharing small pieces of writing with close friends. The reactions were encouraging, though understated. His work was unusual, strange in tone, precise in detail, and filled with quiet tension. Friends noted this, even if they couldn't yet predict what it meant. Franz accepted their praise with the same reserve he brought to everything else. He did not seek attention, but he did appreciate the validation. To most people, Franz Kafka, at the end of this period, simply appeared as a responsible young man who worked at an insurance office, lived at home, and maintained a predictable routine. Nothing dramatic marked these years. No major publications, no bold career moves, no personal upheavals. And yet, beneath the surface, the foundation of his future writing life was quietly forming. By 1911, Franz had become a diligent employee, a cautious writer, and a man who lived between two worlds without fully belonging to either. The next phase would begin to reveal the first traces of the author he would become, though it would arrive gradually, without fanfare, and almost without his consent. By 1911, Franz Kafka was settling into a rhythm that had become familiar. Long days at the insurance office, quiet evenings at home, and late nights spent writing. Nothing in his outward life signaled a dramatic shift. Yet this period quietly marked the beginning of his emergence as an author. Not publicly at first, only within himself and within the circles of people who knew him well. Although Franz had written privately for years, something changed during this time. His desire to write moved from a quiet pastime to a more deliberate effort. This shift wasn't the result of a single event. It came gradually, through the accumulation of ideas and the encouragement of those around him, especially Max Brod. Brod, who had become one of his closest companions, saw potential in Franz's early writings. He offered consistent reassurance, the kind that helped Franz take his creativity more seriously, even if he didn't yet envision himself as an author. Brod's enthusiasm contrasted with Franz's cautious nature, but the difference between them created a balance. It was during these years that Franz began to feel, in a quiet and private way, that writing might be something more than an evening habit. Around this time, Brod introduced Franz to more writers, musicians, and thinkers in Prague. These were informal gatherings, discussions in cafes, evenings at small salons, and readings hosted by local cultural groups. Franz rarely took the spotlight. He preferred to listen, observing others with the same attentiveness that had marked his behavior since childhood. The conversations exposed him to new artistic ideas, modernist experimentation, philosophical questions about identity, and evolving styles of prose. None of these influences appeared dramatically in his work yet, but they shaped the background of his creative thinking. He remained reserved, but these interactions slowly pulled him deeper into the literary world that he had once only watched from a distance. In 1911, Franz accompanied Max Brod to Paris. The trip was brief but memorable, partly because it was one of the few times Franz stepped beyond the routines of his daily life. They attended performances, explored the streets, and visited galleries. Franz took in the city quietly, allowing impressions to settle without rushing to interpret them. He did not become suddenly worldly or bold after this trip. He returned to Prague and resumed his normal life. Nevertheless, the journey expanded his sense of what existed beyond his daily environment, something that would eventually appear in subtle ways in his later writing. In late 1912, Franz experienced something unusual for him, a concentrated burst of creative energy. In one long, uninterrupted night, he wrote The Judgment, a story unlike anything he had produced before. It was intense, sharply structured, and filled with the quiet tension that would later define his style. The experience left him shaken, both proud and uncertain. He read the story aloud to Brod and a small group of friends, and their response was enthusiastic. They recognized something remarkable, even if Franz struggled to see it himself. This moment did not make him confident, but it did mark a turning point. For the first time, he felt that writing could produce something coherent, something strong, something worth sharing. After The Judgment, Franz continued writing more steadily. He filled notebooks with fragments, short pieces, and beginnings of longer works. He did not publish most of them. Some he abandoned, others he kept without showing anyone. His progress was not linear or dramatic. It was patient, like most things in his life. He developed habits, writing past midnight, revising quietly, and setting aside pieces he didn't feel satisfied with. His desk became a place where stories formed and dissolved in various stages of completion. In 1915, during this same period of growing determination, Franz's most famous novella, The Metamorphosis, was published. But when it first appeared, it did not create the kind of reaction one might expect today. It received some attention within certain literary circles, but it did not generate widespread recognition. Franz accepted this reception calmly. He had not expected acclaim. He was more concerned with the imperfections he felt in the text than with public reaction. The publication, however modest in impact, marked the first moment his work reached beyond his personal circle in a noticeable way. Throughout these years, Franz continued working at the insurance office. The responsibilities increased over time, requiring more precision, longer hours, and difficult assessments of workplace accidents. He performed these tasks diligently, even though they left him little time for rest. The contrast between his daytime work and his nighttime writing grew sharper. Some nights, he wrote only a few paragraphs before exhaustion caught up with him. Other nights, he wrote for hours, losing track of time in the quiet solitude of his room. Writing didn't free him from obligation, but it offered a refuge, a place where he could think in ways the office did not allow. By 1915, a few people in Prague's literary community had begun to notice Franz's evolving voice. His stories, though unusual and difficult to categorize, captured something distinctive. Friends admired his precision and the subtle emotional undercurrents in his work. But the circle remained small. Franz was still an unknown figure outside these limited groups. He did not seek larger audiences or public attention. He wrote because he felt compelled to, not because he expected recognition. These years laid the groundwork for what would become his most active period as a writer. Nothing was rushed, nothing was forced, and nothing appeared to change dramatically from the outside. Yet, inside the quiet rooms where Franz spent his nights, the beginnings of a literary identity were forming, slowly, carefully, and almost reluctantly. The next chapter would lead him into a complicated period of relationships, doubts, and personal conflict, all of which would shape the tone of his writing in ways he had not anticipated. By 1912, Franz Kafka's life had settled into a rhythm that felt stable, even if it lacked excitement. He worked at the insurance office, he wrote at night, and he maintained a small circle of thoughtful friends. Nothing seemed poised to disrupt this routine, until a single letter introduced him to someone who would alter the emotional landscape of his life. In August 1912, at a gathering hosted by Max Brod, Franz met Felice Bauer. The meeting itself was brief. They did not speak for long, but something about her clarity of speech, her straightforward manner, and her practical energy left an impression on him. A few days later, he sent her a letter. It was polite, thoughtful, and carefully composed. She responded. What began as a simple exchange soon became a steady stream of correspondence. Their letters grew longer, more personal, and more frequent. For Franz, who often struggled to express himself in conversation, writing provided a comfortable distance. Through these letters, he disclosed his habits, fears, doubts, and hopes. Felice replied with openness and warmth. Their connection grew not through shared daily experiences, but through the quiet intimacy of written words. The relationship that formed between Franz and Felice was shaped almost entirely by letters. They did not see each other often. When they did meet, the rhythm of their relationship shifted. The ease Franz felt in writing sometimes turned into hesitation during face-to-face interactions. Felice, practical and decisive, preferred clarity. Franz, reflective and inward, often needed time. Despite these differences, the correspondence continued. Franz wrote late at night, often after long hours at the office. He filled pages with thoughts on work, literature, and the complicated tangle of his emotions. Felice's letters became a regular part of his routine, something he looked forward to even as he struggled with the idea of serious commitment. By 1914, the relationship had grown serious, enough that an engagement was arranged. The decision was not impulsive. It was the result of long discussions, family considerations, and a sense of responsibility more than passion. Franz wanted stability, but he also feared the demands of marriage. Felicia wanted clarity and partnership. The engagement was announced, and for a moment, it seemed that Franz's life was settling into a predictable path. Work, marriage, and continued writing in the quiet hours. But his doubts did not disappear. The more real the engagement became, the more Franz felt the conflict between his desire for companionship and his need for solitude. He feared that marriage would consume the time he used for writing. He worried about his health, which had always been fragile. He questioned whether he could meet the expectations of a conventional life. These doubts did not arise suddenly. They accumulated quietly, the way his hesitations always did, slowly forming until they felt impossible to ignore. He continued writing to Felice, but the tone of his letters shifted. There was affection, but also uncertainty. There was hope, but also self-doubt. The very medium that had brought them together began to reveal the emotional distance between them. The engagement broke off before plans could solidify. There was no dramatic confrontation, no sudden event that forced the decision. It was simply the outcome of weeks of deliberation, uneasy conversations, and the realization that their needs and temperaments did not align. For Felice, the separation was painful, but practical. She valued stability. She understood that Franz, for reasons he couldn't always articulate, could not give her the life she hoped for. For Franz, the ending created a mixture of relief and guilt. He did not regret the affection they had shared, but he recognized that he had been unable to resolve the conflict within himself. Despite the emotional strain, the connection between Franz and Felice did not disappear entirely. They resumed correspondence later, more cautiously this time. Familiar patterns re-emerged. Letters grew longer. The sense of companionship returned, though shaded with hesitation. Eventually, discussions about marriage resurfaced, and a second engagement was formed, but the underlying issues had not changed. Franz still felt divided between his need for quiet introspection and the responsibilities expected of him. Felice still hoped for clarity and forward movement. This second engagement, like the first, dissolved quietly. The separation was final, though it ended without hostility. They had cared for each other deeply, but their lives moved in different directions. These 5 years shaped Franz's emotional life in ways that would influence his writing. The letters he wrote to Felice, thoughtful, anxious, and intensely introspective, revealed his struggle to balance personal connection with his inner temperament. His relationships during these years did not break him, but they revealed truths about himself that he could no longer ignore. He needed long stretches of solitude. He feared losing time for writing. He doubted his ability to meet traditional expectations. He wanted companionship, but struggled with its demands. These were not dramatic revelations. They developed slowly, through quiet reflection and the repeated tension between desire and hesitation. Toward the end of this period, Franz began experiencing signs of physical exhaustion, persistent fatigue, discomfort breathing, and recurring illness. He did not yet know the cause, but these early symptoms hinted at a shift in the years ahead. What began as strain would soon become something more serious. Despite the turmoil of these years, Franz continued writing. He produced stories, fragments, and early versions of novels that he would later revise or abandon. These works carried the tone of his emotional life: quiet tension, internal conflict, and the sense of being caught between competing forces. On the surface, His life from 1912 to 1917 appeared uneventful. A job, some travels, occasional social gatherings, and 2 engagements that ended without lasting change. But within these years, Franz learned more about his own limitations than he ever had before. He discovered the boundaries of his emotional endurance, the delicacy of his health, and the depth of his need for quiet. The next chapter would usher in a new development, one that would shift the structure of his life in a more concrete way: the arrival of illness. By 1917, Franz Kafka was living a life defined by familiar routines. He worked steadily at the insurance office, wrote in the late hours of the night, and maintained careful distance from anything that felt overwhelming. The emotional turbulence of his relationship with Felice Bauer had faded into the background. He had returned to the predictable rhythm that had always felt safest to him. But this rhythm would soon be interrupted, not by a dramatic event, but by the gradual emergence of an illness that would reshape the next phase of his life. During the summer of 1917, Franz began experiencing unusual fatigue. He had always been delicate in health, but this was different, a persistent tiredness that didn't lift with rest. He continued working, continued writing, and continued living according to his habits, but the tiredness stayed. It grew heavier. One night in August, after coughing repeatedly, he noticed blood. The sight startled him, though he tried at first to treat it as an isolated incident, but the coughing continued, and so did the bleeding. These symptoms made it clear that something more serious was happening. A doctor confirmed what Franz had suspected: tuberculosis. The illness, already recognized as a major threat in Europe at the time, required rest, quiet, and a retreat from the responsibilities of everyday life. For the first time in his adult life, Franz took a long leave from work. The insurance office, understanding the severity of his condition, granted him extended sick leave. He packed his belongings and left Prague for the countryside, seeking the fresh air and slower pace that doctors recommended. This transition was not dramatic in appearance, but it carried a significant emotional weight. The structure of his days, something he had lived by for more than a decade, fell away. What remained was emptiness, silence, and the uncertain path of recovery. In the countryside, Franz settled into a small rural home, far from the noise of the city. His days followed a gentle pattern: short walks, long periods of rest, and hours of reading or quiet reflection. Writing became sporadic. Some days he wrote a few pages. Other days he felt too weak or unfocused to put words onto paper. The open landscape provided a peaceful environment. He watched the weather change, listened to the distant sounds of animals and farm work, and allowed himself a slower pace. But even in this setting, he could not escape the awareness that his health was uncertain. Friends visited occasionally. Their conversations were calm and supportive, but after they left, Franz often felt the need to retreat inward again. His energy had become fragile. Illness altered the way Franz saw his life. Before tuberculosis, he had always worried about balancing work, writing, and relationships. Now, the concern was more basic: the strength to get out of bed, the ability to breathe clearly, and the hope of avoiding further complications. This period did not bring dramatic revelations. Instead, it created a quiet clarity. Franz realized how much of his life had been shaped by pressure from family expectations, pressure from his job, pressure he placed on himself. The illness removed those structures, leaving him with a stripped-down version of his life. With fewer external demands, he became more aware of the interior world he had always lived with. Over these years, Franz slowly withdrew from social circles. He did not cut ties abruptly. Rather, he wrote fewer letters, attended fewer gatherings, and kept communication limited to those closest to him. He no longer had the strength for long discussions, crowded events, or intellectual debates. Even his relationship with literature changed. He read more slowly, choosing works that required less effort. Writing, once his nightly refuge, became something he had to approach with caution. He still cared for it deeply, but lacked the stamina to produce at the pace he once did. During this period, Franz relied more on his sisters and on a few close friends for emotional support. Their letters brought the outside world into the quiet spaces of his recovery. They wrote about daily life in Prague, cultural happenings, and family matters. These exchanges helped him stay connected without requiring more than he could give. He responded thoughtfully, but his letters were often shorter and more reserved than before. Toward the end of this period, Franz began corresponding with Milena Jasenska, a talented and perceptive translator living in Vienna. She had begun translating his work into Czech, and their professional interaction soon grew into a meaningful friendship. Milena's letters were warm and insightful. She understood the emotional tone of his writing in a way few others did. Their exchanges were honest, unguarded, and deeply personal without becoming romantic in a conventional sense. Franz valued this connection. The letters became something he looked forward to, evidence that even in illness and isolation, he could still share his inner world with someone who understood it. By 1920, Franz's condition had stabilized somewhat, not cured, but more manageable. With care and rest, the most severe symptoms had lessened. He returned to Prague, though not with the energy he once had. He remained cautious, avoiding strenuous activities and limiting his work. The illness had reshaped his life permanently. It had narrowed his world, but it also clarified what mattered to him: quiet, writing, and a small circle of trusted relationships. He did not attempt to reclaim his old routines. Instead, he accepted a slower, more deliberate way of living. These 3 years marked the beginning of the long decline that would affect the rest of Franz Kafka's life. But they also brought a certain peace, a rhythm that allowed him to focus on literature without the distractions that had once filled his days. As he stepped into the next stage of his life, he carried not just the weight of illness, but the awareness that time, energy, and opportunity were now limited. This understanding would shape the tone and urgency of his later writing in quiet but lasting ways. When Franz Kafka returned to Prague around 1920, he did so with a reduced sense of strength but an increased awareness of his limits. The years of illness had altered his daily habits and expectations. Work, writing, relationships, and even simple routines now required careful management. Nothing could be rushed. Nothing could be taken for granted. After settling back into the city, Franz resumed a modest version of his former life. He lived quietly with his family, rested often, and limited social obligations. The tuberculosis had not disappeared. It had simply become more manageable for the moment. He understood that his health depended on maintaining a delicate balance between activity and rest. He no longer attempted the long work days he had once endured at the insurance office. His job granted him partial leave, and his responsibilities were reduced. Even so, the little work he performed required careful pacing. Fatigue arrived quickly, and he recognized its arrival as a signal to stop, not to push through it. During this period, Franz's connection with Milena Jasenska grew more significant. Their correspondence had begun with her interest in translating his stories, but by 1920, their exchanges had become deeply personal. Milena approached his thoughts with rare clarity, responding to his concerns with empathy and intelligence. Their letters revealed a mutual understanding that did not depend on physical presence. Franz often found it easier to express himself in writing than in conversation, and Milena responded with warmth and consistency. When they eventually met in person in Vienna, their conversations confirmed what their letters had already established: a shared sensitivity and a mutual respect. Still, Franz sensed that the complicated nature of his health, his uncertainty about commitment, and Milena's own circumstances made any lasting relationship unlikely. Their connection remained emotionally meaningful, but quietly constrained by reality. Despite his ongoing health issues, Franz found renewed energy for writing, not in large quantities, but in concentrated bursts that produced some of his later and more polished pieces. The act of writing remained the closest thing to stability in his life. He worked on short stories and fragments, each shaped by his characteristic clarity and restraint. Some pieces emerged with unusual sharpness, as though his limited energy forced him to write only what was essential. He did not attempt long novels. Instead, he focused on concise, tightly written works that reflected his internal world. During this time, he composed stories that later formed part of the collection A Hunger Artist, published in 1924. These stories carried a tone of quiet resignation, a sense that the characters inhabited spaces defined by isolation, observation, and the quiet pressure of unspoken expectations. Writing, though meaningful, took a toll on him physically. Long hours at a desk left him exhausted, forcing him to ration his creative energy carefully. He often wrote in the early mornings, when the house was silent, and the day had not yet drained his strength. He accepted that his productivity would never match his ambition. Instead of writing as much as he wished, he wrote only as much as his health allowed. This constrained pattern became a defining feature of his late years. By 1923, Franz felt the need to distance himself from his family home, not out of conflict, but out of a desire for independence and calm. His sisters were caring and attentive, but the constant activity of the household made it difficult for him to maintain the quiet he needed for writing and rest. An opportunity arose to move to Berlin, and he decided to go. The move was modest. No dramatic relocation, just a quiet shift to a different environment. In Berlin, he intended to live simply and write peacefully. In Berlin, Franz met Dora Diamant, a young woman who worked at a children's home. Dora was warm, gentle, and perceptive. Her presence carried a sense of reassurance that Franz had not experienced in many years. Unlike earlier relationships, this companionship did not revolve around long letters or intellectual debates. It was simple and steady. Dora understood his limitations without judgment. She supported his writing, helped him manage daily tasks, and created a calm environment that allowed him to rest. Her companionship brought a measure of peace to the final period of his life. Berlin, however, presented challenges. The German economy was unstable, and inflation made daily life increasingly difficult. Prices rose rapidly, savings lost their value, and even basic necessities became harder to afford. Franz and Dora lived modestly, sometimes relying on help from friends or family. The financial strain was constant, but not dramatic. It was simply one more quiet burden that Franz learned to endure. Throughout this period, Franz became more aware of how fragile his health had become. Coughing worsened, breathing grew more difficult. Simple tasks required rest afterward. He rarely spoke about his fears directly, but his letters reflected a growing sense of impermanence. He continued writing, but at a slower pace. Each completed story felt like a small accomplishment. He knew time was limited, though he did not dwell on the idea. Despite everything, financial strain, illness, emotional uncertainty, his writing retained its clarity. The stories of these years carried the calm precision that had become his signature. They were not optimistic, but neither were they despairing. They simply reflected the spaces he occupied: quiet rooms, distant relationships, and the internal landscapes shaped by limited strength. By late 1923, Franz's health had weakened significantly. Dora cared for him with gentle attention, but they both understood that the illness was progressing faster than rest could contain. The time in Berlin had brought him companionship and creative focus, but it had also revealed the limits of what his body could endure. He would soon need more consistent medical care, and the next phase of his life would bring him to a sanatorium where the final months unfolded with the same quiet understatement that had marked most of his years. By the beginning of 1924, Franz Kafka's strength had diminished to a point where daily life in Berlin was no longer manageable. His coughing had worsened, eating caused pain, sleep came in short, fragile intervals. Dora Diamant did everything she could to support him, but the illness had advanced beyond what rest and care at home could relieve. A doctor advised that he move to a sanatorium where treatment would be more structured and constant. Franz agreed quietly, not out of optimism, but because he understood it was necessary. The decision carried no drama, just the calm acceptance that had always defined the way he approached difficult circumstances. In April 1924, Franz traveled to the small town of Kierling, near Vienna, and entered the local sanatorium. The building was modest: long corridors, tall windows, and simple rooms that held little more than a bed, a chair, and a small writing table. The sanatorium was not a place of recovery so much as a place of comfort for those in the later stages of illness. Dora accompanied him, staying nearby to visit as often as possible. Her presence brought a sense of familiarity to the otherwise sterile environment. Franz settled into a gentle routine. Nurses checked on him regularly, meals were prepared with care, and he was encouraged to rest for most of the day. His world had become smaller than ever, contained within the walls of a quiet room, surrounded by patients who moved softly to conserve their strength. The days passed slowly. Franz spent most of his time lying in bed or sitting by the window, where he could see a small patch of landscape, a few trees, a narrow path, and the shifting patterns of light as clouds moved overhead. Reading became more difficult as fatigue increased, but he continued to pick up books occasionally, flipping through pages even when he lacked the energy to absorb them fully. Writing was even harder. He managed short notes, fragments of thoughts, and letters to friends, but longer works were now beyond his physical capacity. Visitors came when they could: Max Broad, his sisters, and a few other close acquaintances. Their conversations were gentle and unhurried. They did not speak about recovery. They spoke about books, about mutual friends, about small happenings in Prague or Berlin. Franz appreciated these visits, though they often left him too tired to speak afterward. Dora continued to visit him regularly, offering companionship and quiet care. She assisted with small tasks, read to him when he felt up to it, and helped him manage the discomfort that had become part of his daily life. Their relationship during these months was marked not by dramatic declarations, but by steadiness. Franz had always struggled with the demands of close relationships, yet in these final months, he allowed himself to lean gently on the stability Dora provided. There was no expectation of the future, only the daily comfort of someone present. As the illness progressed, eating became increasingly painful. Tuberculosis had affected Franz's throat, making swallowing difficult and eventually unbearable. Meals had to be modified, softened, and often replaced with liquid nourishment. Even then, Each attempt caused discomfort that left him exhausted. This inability to eat created a quiet anxiety around mealtimes, something he seldom spoke about but felt deeply. It also weakened him further, limiting what little energy he had left. Franz understood that the illness was nearing its end. He did not speak dramatically about death, nor did he ignore its approach. He simply acknowledged it in the quiet, deliberate way he approached most things. His letters from this time, though fewer, reflected an acceptance of his condition. He expressed concern for those he cared about, apologized for being a burden, and maintained a gentle tone even when describing discomfort. There was no bitterness in his words, only tiredness. In late May, his condition worsened noticeably. Breathing became more labored. Speaking caused pain. Even brief conversations left him exhausted. Nurses observed the decline and adjusted his care accordingly, focusing on keeping him comfortable. During these days, Dora remained close. She read to him softly, held his hand when he felt anxious, and helped him rest when pain made sleep difficult. Franz welcomed these moments quietly, without dramatic gestures. In the calm of the sanatorium, surrounded by soft footsteps and muted voices, he spent his final days in an atmosphere of stillness. On June 3, 1924, Franz Kafka died at the age of 40. His passing was gentle and expected. Dora was present, along with one of the attending doctors. There were no sudden changes, no dramatic scenes, just a gradual quieting, followed by calm. After his death, his body was transported back to Prague, where he was buried in the new Jewish cemetery in Žižkov. His funeral was modest, attended by family, close friends, and a few individuals from the literary circles that had known him. In the weeks following his death, those who had known him reflected quietly on his life. They remembered his gentle manner, his careful way of speaking, and the calm thoughtfulness that had shaped his interactions. At this point, Franz Kafka was not a well-known author. His work had been published only in limited forms, mostly appreciated by small literary groups. His reputation had not yet grown beyond those circles. To most people, he was simply a quiet man who had lived modestly, worked responsibly, and written privately. The transformation of his legacy, the rise of his posthumous fame, would begin only after his friend Max Brod made a decision that Franz himself had asked him not to make. That story belongs to the final chapter. After Franz Kafka's death in June 1924, the world around him continued quietly, almost unaware that anything significant had happened. He had been a modest office worker, a sensitive friend, and an author known only to a small group of literary acquaintances. There was no public announcement, no large memorial, no immediate sense that a major writer had been lost. But the future of his work rested on a decision made not by him, but by one of the people who had known him most closely. Before his death, Franz had left a handwritten note for his friend Max Brod. The message was simple and direct. He asked Brod to burn all of his unpublished manuscripts, everything he had not personally prepared for publication. Franz wanted the notebooks, drafts, fragments, and unfinished novels destroyed. He did not explain this request in detail. Those who knew him understood that he often doubted the worth of his own writing and feared leaving behind anything imperfect. The instruction was clear. Yet Max Brod had made a decision long before Franz died. He would not follow it. When Brod retrieved Franz's papers, notebooks, and manuscripts, he saw not material to be burned, but work that deserved to be read. He believed that Franz's writing held a rare quality, precise, unsettling, and unique. He felt a responsibility not only as a friend, but as someone who recognized literary value. So instead of carrying out Franz's command, Broad did the opposite. He sorted the papers carefully, organized drafts, and prepared manuscripts for publication. It was a quiet act of preservation, carried out without fanfare. Some later viewed this as an act of betrayal. Others saw it as the only reason the world ever came to know Franz Kafka. Broad himself never wavered. He believed he had acted in the service of literature. In 1925, 1 year after Franz's death, Broad published The Trial, Der Prozess. The novel, unfinished at the time of Franz's death, was assembled from chapters and fragments. Broad arranged them into a coherent order based on Kafka's notes and his own understanding of the material. The book was unusual, unsettling in tone, precise in language, and filled with quiet tension. It did not immediately become a bestseller, but it drew the attention of critics who recognized something distinctive in its atmosphere. The publication marked the beginning of Kafka's slow emergence into the literary world. Over the next few years, Broad continued his work of organizing and publishing Franz's manuscripts. The Castle, Das Schloss, appeared in 1926. America, sometimes titled The Man Who Disappeared, appeared in 1927. These novels, also unfinished, carried the same calm strangeness that had characterized much of his earlier work. Readers found them difficult to categorize. They were too precise to be dreamlike, yet too unsettling to be realistic. Critics struggled to define them, but they recognized a voice unlike any other. Public recognition was still limited, but the foundation of Kafka's posthumous reputation had begun. Throughout the late 1920s and 1930s, Kafka's work circulated gradually through European literary communities. Small journals published essays about his themes. Writers discussed him in cafes and lecture halls. The distinct quality of his prose, the sense of quiet pressure, isolation, and unreachable authority, resonated with a world undergoing political change. He was not yet a global figure, but he had become a subject of serious interest among critics and authors. As Kafka's influence grew, translators began rendering his works into other languages. English, French, and Italian editions appeared. Each new translation expanded the audience slightly further. Readers outside of Europe discovered his writing slowly, often through literary journals or university courses. His reputation grew in the way his stories unfolded, quietly, steadily, and without sudden leaps. The political turmoil of the 1930s and 1940s, especially the rise of totalitarian regimes, brought new relevance to Kafka's themes. His portrayals of unclear authority, rigid bureaucracy, and individuals trapped within incomprehensible systems resonated deeply during this period. After the Second World War, interest in Kafka surged. His works were studied not only for their literary qualities, but also for their insights into the nature of power, alienation, and modern anxiety. The quiet writer from Prague, who had never sought fame, became a symbol of 20th century literature. Through the mid-century, Kafka's reputation grew steadily. Scholars wrote detailed analyses of his novels and stories. Universities taught his works in literature and philosophy courses. Critics debated his themes, symbols, and possible meanings. Artists and filmmakers adapted elements of his writing into other mediums. Kafka's work, once confined to private notebooks and limited circles, became part of a broader cultural conversation. Despite his growing fame, many questions remained. What order did he intend for his unfinished novels? How much editing would he have done if he had lived longer? How accurate were Broad's decisions when assembling fragmented manuscripts? These questions continue to influence discussions of Kafka's work today. The ambiguity, so characteristic of Kafka himself, became part of his legacy. By the second half of the 20th century, Franz Kafka had become one of the most influential writers in modern literature. His works were studied worldwide, translated into dozens of languages, and referenced in discussions about psychology, philosophy, and political systems. The term Kafkaesque entered the vocabulary, describing situations that mirrored the atmosphere his stories captured. Yet none of this recognition reached Kafka during his lifetime. He did not know that his incomplete manuscripts would one day shape global literature. He did not imagine that his name would become a cultural reference point. He lived quietly, wrote cautiously, and doubted the value of his work until the end. In the end, Kafka's legacy grew in the same way he lived, slowly, quietly, and with a certain deliberate stillness. His stories continue to resonate because they reflect fundamental aspects of human experience: uncertainty, observation, isolation, and the quiet pressures of ordinary life. The man who once doubted his own writing became one of the defining voices of the modern age. His manuscripts, saved against his wishes, carried his voice forward into generations he never lived to see. Franz Kafka's life did not unfold with dramatic scenes or sweeping achievements. It moved in small steps, shaped by routine, introspection, and the steady duties of work and family. He lived quietly, wrote cautiously, and carried more doubts than certainties. From the outside, his days appeared ordinary: simple commutes, long evenings at a desk, the quiet turning of pages, the slow accumulation of manuscripts that he was never sure anyone needed to read. Yet within that quiet life existed a depth that only became visible later. His stories, written in the stillness of night, survived the limitations he placed on them. They traveled beyond the rooms where they were created, beyond the small circles that first read them, and beyond the time in which he lived. What Franz saw as fragments became, in the hands of the world, reflections of modern life. His writing outlived the doubts that shaped it. His voice reached farther than he ever imagined, and the man who once insisted his work should vanish became a writer whose presence continues long after his body is gone. There is no grand conclusion to his life, no triumphant final chapter. Instead, there is a gentle recognition that even the quietest individuals can leave behind something lasting. Franz Kafka lived modestly, wrote privately, and departed quietly. But his words remained, and in the calm way he never expected, they continue to speak.